in that kind of yellowish gray color. Over the next 15 years, there were 100 units built. And what's interesting to note is that in the ones that existed in 1999, the grand majority are in the village center. The grand majority of those red dots, the ones that appeared over those last 15 years, are all over the town. Most of our development that's happening is not happening now in the village centers. It's happening all over the place. Subdivision of land is mostly happening in these rural residential areas along those back roads. And it's happening one house at a time. These aren't big developments. Most of what's happening for fragmentation is just one house and then another and another over time. So going back to that green map, that map that we originally showed as this is 80% of Vermont is covered by trees. It's forested. How can we see what's forest and what's trees on this green, on this 80% of the landscape? What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this map. Whoops, that map. This is really the same map. It's covering all of the forest in green. The yellow is the open areas or the non-forested areas. So you can see both agricultural land and development in yellow. The red that we've added to this map is all the urban centers. So you can see up in Chittenden County. You can see Rutland. You can see the population centers in red. You can ignore those black lines. That's just separating the state into regions, but not important for now. And so as you look at that 80% forest from maybe a wildlife perspective of which of those forests are really intact and are healthy and can be used as habitat, let's highlight the things that are not good habitat. So right now we have highlighted those urban centers. Now let's add the roads. Roads are not really good habitat for anything. There's the roads across Vermont. I have a lot of roads in Vermont. I have heard, I've not confirmed, but I've heard that you can never be more than 2 miles from a road in Vermont. There's no really true wilderness. That's what I've heard. And there's a lot of roads in the state. Now what happens if we add all of our buildings? Any building in the state, any infrastructure? Then we have that. And suddenly the state doesn't look quite as green. There's still a lot of green. That's still 80% green. It's just that pattern is very different. If you're really thinking about these large blocks of healthy forest, it's not maybe the same picture as we thought from the picture on the left. So with fragmentation, with all these roads and buildings that are cutting through the forest, what's impacted? There are impacts to all kinds of things, and I'll go into wildlife more in a few minutes, but there are certainly impacts to wildlife. Working forests have a really hard time too. As the size of those forests gets smaller and smaller, the likelihood that they're going to be used for timber or be managed as working forests decreases. Recreational access goes down. Invasive species go along those roads and they follow the paths of human development. As fragmentation happens, we can have diminished water quality. We can have more intense flooding. We can have an increase in tick-borne illnesses like Lyme. Our forests lose their ability to sequester carbon as we think about climate change. And so, what are the solutions? How do we address all of these problems associated with fragmentation? Any ideas? Or wait, that's what we're here for, huh? I wish there were some, easy answer that I could just give you. We're going to be talking later today about some.
What about other states? Have other states come up with?
Yeah, and we'll talk about tools for addressing this later. I'm starting this though by saying there isn't one strategy that's going to be really easy to do as we address it. But there are some things to think about. One way to think about this is to think about the landscape in terms of 2 scales. I think as we address fragmentation, we need to think about 2 big things. We're going to need to think about a landscape. So this is a Vermont landscape. Is there some fragmentation there? Mm-hmm. There's definitely some fragmentation. And so as we look at our landscapes, what we've started doing at Fish and Wildlife is looking at it in terms of looking first for those large forest blocks. Where are the largest forest blocks in an area still? And then once you've identified those, you can think about some ways of keeping those large forest blocks as large forest blocks. But those large forest blocks are really going to stay the healthiest if they can also stay connected. Even though there's that one line that goes through the middle that's a road, if there's still some permeability between those forest blocks, the more the better. So we also need to think about these connections between them. And I'll go into more detail here in a minute. So starting with those large forest blocks. Now these ones are a little bit more intuitive to think about. We're looking at big chunks of forest, right? At the Agency of Natural Resources, we've started to map those forest blocks across the state. Now this is really, if you think back to where I added all the roads and development into the green map, it's kind of the same thing. It's just the reverse. This is looking at those forest blocks. The bigger ones are in darker colors, the lighter ones are in lighter colors, the smaller ones are in lighter colors. But this is all of the forests as surrounded by roads and development in the state of Vermont that are at least 20 acres. Okay. Now, as I highlight these forest blocks, I'm going to say that what we define as forest here is really undeveloped land. It's undeveloped land that is not actively in agriculture as well. So something like this picture down here with all the shrub swamp in the beginning is a wetland in the foreground, that would count. It's not big tall trees that we usually associate with forests, but it's undeveloped habitat. And as we zoom in, we can start to think about what that looks like at a regional scale or a town scale. And we'll go into more detail in this kind of maps later on. But now I know you can't read the things in this picture, but as we think about these forest blocks, it kind of begs the question, well, so how big is big enough? What are you aiming for? If this is mapping any forest block that's at least 20 acres, well, you know, is that good enough? Do we need something that's 50,000 acres? How much is enough? And my answer is really, it depends on where you are. The bigger tends to be better. And what this chart is showing is it's listing a bunch of species that are present in undeveloped land, and then as these blocks get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, it's crossing out the species that no longer live in those smaller blocks of land. And without going into any detail, just the point here is, the bigger, the more species, the more biodiverse, if all else is equal. And that's not always true. The Champlain Valley is a really rich area. The Connecticut River Valley also has a lot of richness. So not everything is equal. But in general, the bigger, the better in terms of biodiversity. Now let's go into those connections. So those big forest blocks are needed, but those connections between them are also needed. And oftentimes that's happening in a landscape that looks something like this. It's a pretty fragmented landscape. It's not looking at the biggest and best patches of forest out there. We're looking at those places in between. And really what we're talking about is this patch of forest, I know maybe that's a 100-acre patch of forest. Well, that's great, but if it doesn't connect to anything else, if the wildlife in that 100-acre patch of forest can't go anywhere, if it's surrounded by development, it's going to be pretty limited what can live there. Whereas, if you have a landscape that's connected, then, you know, the same blocks of habitat can be home to a much more diverse mix of species if they're part of this, if they can be connected to other things. As you look at a landscape, and if you start to look at your own town or your own area in this way, and start to look for those connections, I like to use the image of something like a black bear. And if you can imagine this animal moving through the landscape, you can start to pick out some of these connections. Now a black bear is an animal that does, it needs at least 30 square miles as it roams around. And that's partly seasonally, it needs different food sources at different times of the year that might be in different habitats. They need to disperse and find mates. So this is one species of animal that might actually physically move around from patch to patch. And if you think about this landscape, you can start to identify those blocks of habitat that are going to be maybe where it spends most of its time. But it's only going to really move through this landscape if it can cross this road without going through a lot of development, or get between these other blocks somehow, some way. You can start to pick out the routes it might take to stay under cover or stay away from a lot of buildings. But it's not really just about the big mammals like a black bear. When you think about it, a black bear is something that's pretty easy to get your mind around moving through the landscape, and they do that. But what we're really concerned about here is all species. Most species in Vermont need to move at some point or another, whether that's, a bat flying through the air, which has somewhat different barriers than a bear, or a salamander going to a vernal pool where it reproduces at one time of the year, and then going up to the upland forest at another time. With plants, it might just be that seed needs to land someplace in order to grow a new tree. Everything at some point, even if it's generations apart, kind of moves through the landscape. And this is especially true as we think about moving with climate change. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about climate change, but the point here is if we're going to allow our species to shift as they need to adapt to changes, one of the best ways to do this is to provide these connectors and the intact forests. What's at stake here is a lot of these values that we listed in the beginning. That's all part of this intact, healthy forests. But it's not even just about our Vermont values. The map that I'm showing you is from the Staying Connected Initiative and Two Countries, One Forest, groups of organizations that are working together to look at forests and wildlife internationally. And what they've realized is that we have a big wildlife population that really covers this entire region, all the way from the Adirondacks to the Gaspé Peninsula. Our wildlife right now move and expand and contract their ranges and connect throughout that whole region. They've also identified a few areas, the ones that are in colors, where that ability to move around and connect, it's happening in fragmented landscapes, and they're starting to have a hard time. And so those areas are really critical for the maintenance of these wildlife populations on this really grand international scale across the Northeast. So in that grand scale vision, Vermont is right at the crossroads. This is really where wildlife are moving through to get from the Adirondacks up into Canada, down into the Berkshires, over to the whites and the blues of Maine. Sorry. No worries. So what happens really right here is really important at this international scale. Like I said, right, what happens in this landscape, these little road crossings, really makes a difference at a scale much larger than us. Now, our timing of this is partly because the legislature of Vermont has been recognizing forest fragmentation as an issue over the last few years. In 2014, there was an act that basically wanted a report of the status of our forests. And that was followed by new legislation in 2015 that talked about policy options. So there was a study team that came up with a bunch of policy options. And then just this last summer, in the last legislative session, there was a new act that was really starting the implementation of these policies. And it's looking at, among other things, municipal and regional planning and encouraging these large blocks of forest and the connectors to be identified at the town and regional level so that we can start at this scale to address these statewide issues that affect us all. Now, I do have a bunch of maps and we can really start to zoom into this landscape. But I'm wondering, before we do that, if there are questions or comments or thoughts or anything from you.
This gentleman had a question.
Well, I have a lot of questions. I'm probably the devil's advocate.
Go for it.
I am not anti-conservation. I am presently in current use. However, for a town like Topsom, which is heavily forested,
Yeah.
we don't foresee a large development, but individual homes throughout the town. Our villages are not adapt for expansion of population because of the close proximity to the streams.
Right.
So any building will be in the upland hills. And I'm just concerned of land values for the landowners that own these properties.
Right.
And we want to keep our children in the area, and many of our families in town have planned to set aside land for our children. So the impact for our very rural community with large forested blocks, we're a little concerned about how this...
I fully understand that. I'm not going to, I don't want to ignore that question. I want to address that.
Fine.
I'm actually wondering, though, if it might be a better question after we look at the maps. And so we were thinking of looking at some maps and then talking over. I think Kevin has some ideas on the strategies that we can use. So I'm hoping we will address that.
On the map where you had all the species and the colors going through the years, there was a break, I think it was wolf, I forget the other two, and then there was no color, and then at the end of it, there was a pickup of the color.
Oh,
It was a yellow color.
That might have been an error, but let's see.
Can they reintroduce?
Oh, the reintroduced one. Oh, the one from a long time back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know the one you mean. So some things were on that chart were reintroduced.
Well, this was wolf, mountain lion, and...
And Martin.
Martin, yeah, see?
That one.
Now, on the right-hand side...
So Martin is actually kind of a big question mark in Vermont right now. So Martin were reintroduced in, I don't remember the year, 19...
Looks like close to 2000.
Yeah, it's before 2000, so it might be a little bit that way. I was actually thinking it was in the 80s, but it might be on the tail end of that or something. In any case, Martin were reintroduced, and the reintroduction efforts were largely unsuccessful, but Martin are also this really secretive species that are very difficult to track. There have been numerous accounts of people seeing Martin, and some of them are, it's really questionable because they're a similar species to fisher or to smaller weasels. There's a lot of misidentification. There was a reintroduction effort. There may be some around. We're not really sure. So that's why it's there, but it's a species that is not really part of our Vermont list, but it's certainly in nearby areas. The Adirondacks have martins for sure.
I was just wondering, because I read various reports of mountain lions, and I don't know how true some of these reports are.
We could have another whole night about mountain lions and wolves and whether they're here or not. But in general, I mean, if there are any, they're not very many, so they haven't been included on this list. But.
Well, I saw one up in Lowell by the Lowell asbestos mine in 1990. Long tail, middle of the day.
There are many sightings and
yep.
Yep.
And Cedric Alexander's dad proved his son wrong. Cedric's a wildlife biologist, works for your department, and his dad's gone now, but there was a sighting in East Hardwick of what people thought was a mountain lion, and in fact they collected the scat, you probably know this, and he did molds of the tracks and it was confirmed. It was a mom with cubs, so they're reproducing here.
Other thoughts about fragmentation and this topic before we look at some maps? You want to see some maps? Okay, let's go to the maps. Let's see. If you get to see it all again. You didn't know you got to see it twice. Okay.
Good review.
Yes. This is what you just watched. New legislation maps. Okay. So looking into this area, one thing I'll mention before we actually see the maps is that there's a website called BioFinder, the website is right down there, that has all of the information that I'm about to show you. If you want to explore it on your own, it's actually just been updated too. So if you have used BioFinder in the past, just within the last week actually, it has been updated to a new version that has somewhat different information, but it covers everything that I'm about to show you. And you can use it on your own. If you, in your communities, are interested in BioFinder, you can also, it's something I'm happy to talk to you about at a different time of how to use BioFinder. But for now, I'll just mention that it's there, it's a resource. Now, let's go back to the forest blocks. This is the map I've already shown you. So again, this is forest blocks that are surrounded by roads and other development at various sizes in the state. So smallest ones here that are shown are 20 acres. The biggest one is 155,000 acres. That's up in the Northeast Kingdom. And you can see, as expected, that the biggest blocks of habitat are along the spine of the Green Mountains and up in the Northeast Kingdom, and then goes down from there. And once again, we can kind of zoom in on this region and see, just thinking about this region, once again, there's this spine of the Green Mountains, but then there are also some pretty big habitat blocks over in this area. Now, as we're looking at habitat blocks, the great thing about just looking at habitat blocks is that if you keep in mind that rule of thumb of the bigger blocks are generally better or have more species living in them, then you can take that rule to any area. And then even if you live in Hartford, where there's not one of those giant blocks, no, is this Hartford?
Yep.
Okay. Then you can still kind of zoom in and think about, well, what are the biggest habitat areas in Hartford? And those are probably the ones that are going to be more biodiverse. Now, again, not everything is equal, so that's not a promise, but
But you should know you beat Heartland.
It's less. We're
that's
sharing
right.
a big
Hartford,
area with
Hartford, right? So we can also zoom in. This is this area. And once again, just the bigger blocks are more likely to have a richer species biodiversity than the smaller blocks. Now, you can even zoom into a town level and think about these. The limit of any of these maps when you zoom into the town level is that you kind of lose that perspective. You can look at just the town and think about where those biggest blocks are in your town, but when you start thinking about whether they connect or how they, this wildlife traveling through the landscape or a species moving and changing over time, then the town level can be limiting, even though you kind of have to start there to see what you have. So we'll be kind of zooming in and out as we go through these maps. As we look at these, please feel free to stop me with any questions as well. So to zoom back out again, looking at those habitat blocks kind of leaves the question though of, well, so, okay, bigger is better, so in a town scale, down here in West Fairleigh and Fairleigh might have really great habitat, that's the biggest blocks around. But it still leaves you with this question of, well, what do you do? How small is too small to worry about? How big is enough, right? And so we've created some other maps that are trying to take that habitat block data and instead of just listing the size of those blocks, put some meaning in there, saying, well, these ones listed here, these are all taken from that same habitat blocks layer, but these are the ones that biologists with the state, with ANR, have decided, these ones really seem to function as interior forests. These are largely the large blocks in the state. But then it's also including, like in the Champlain Valley, where there aren't really huge blocks, some really critical forest habitat that seems to be functioning as an interior forest, which is like a big piece of forest that doesn't have a lot of the edges, where a forest kind of functions differently in its inside than its outside in its interior. We've listed two different scales. We've listed the darker green are the really high priority. These you can think of them as the best habitat in terms of forest habitat for the state. But then we've also listed a lower priority, still really healthy, good forests. But probably they don't stand out quite as much at the state level if you look at all of the forests in the state.
So how was that determined?
What was that?
How was the high priority determined from the west? But was it field, or was it just
So
maps and
it's,
stuff, or?
Some of each. Some of each. So it starts out looking at size, at block size. So all of the biggest blocks are included. But then that borderline is really unclear because they sectioned it off regionally. So, for example, the Champlain Valley was considered differently than the Green Mountains, which was considered differently than the southern Connecticut River Valley, which is different from the northern Connecticut River Valley. So within each section of the state, they kind of did a consideration that took into account both size and habitat quality.
So what, they had maps, and here, somebody got on a GIS, I guess, and they relied on a map or something? Or?
Well, the habitat blocks are remotely. That's taken from, we know where the roads are in the state, we know where the development is, and we know where the human activity is. And so that kind of outlined these blocks of habitat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much about defining the forest as defining where the forest wasn't, and then taking the rest as natural habitat.
And so the forest, where the forest wasn't, might be, I don't know what the measurement would be, but such and such a distance away from a dwelling?
So, yes.
As an
So
example?
as an example, yes, around dwellings, there's really good land cover data. There's a full data set. I won't go into too much detail, but it maps. It looks down from above, and it has mapped what the land is covered by. Is it covered by an impervious surface like asphalt or a roof or something like that? And it removes all of those from the forest block data. And then it takes roads, and it takes, I'm not the one who did this, so I can't tell you all the details, but it's removed all of those cover classes that are associated with human activity. And what's left in this data set, in this map, this is removing all of the human activity. That's everything that's left. And then if it's one unit that doesn't have anything cutting all the way through the middle of it, then it's included as one block. Does that make sense? More or less? Okay. And then this one is it's removing the smaller ones or the ones that are known. So this one does have some field testing in it. Within the Agency of Natural Resources, a lot is known about the forests in the state of Vermont. And so this is highlighting the ones that are really high quality examples or really large examples of good forest. Does that make sense? So this is just trying to look at, how we separated out the big blocks of forest from the forest connectors? This is not looking at the connections, this is just looking at the big blocks of forest. And we can zoom in. Now remembering that these are highlighted as the priorities at the state level, locally or regionally, you may all decide that you have some slightly different priorities, but these are the ones that were highlighted at the state level in this region. And again, you can kind of see roughly the same blocks as those large ones before come out along the side of the Green Mountains. And then some pretty good forests over here on the eastern part of the region as well. Zooming in, we can look at where those are. And as you zoom in closer and closer, you may start to examine some of these lighter green blocks more and more. Those ones didn't come out as the highest priority at the state level, but that doesn't mean locally that you need to ignore them, because this may be really important, or this one may be really important if you are going in that region. Again, you'll need to, we're not always at the state level the best judge of where the best forests are at the local or regional level. So there will be some decisions to be made here. And we can zoom in even further. But here we have, so we've looked at just these big blocks of forest on this map. Now I'm going to zoom back out, and we can look at the connections between those ones. So once again, looking at the state level, looking at how those forests actually connect to each other to make these networks. We're now trying to connect the spine of the Green Mountains all the way across the state and all the way over into the Adirondacks and through this region all the way up this spine. And so it's not just isolated big chunks of forest, but it's a pathway. Does that make sense? And we'll zoom in. Again, there are the two colors. You can't really see the lighter color at this scale very well, but we'll see it when we zoom in. So we still have the dark green and the light green that were the big forest patches, and now we're adding that kind of olive green color and yellow to the region. So we have what emerges as kind of a U or a V shape in this region as being, that's really where wildlife are moving throughout the region. And as we zoom into this area, we kind of focused in on Bradford. Sorry, Hartford people, just because that's where the meeting is. But you can really see these connections across the area. And as we zoom in, we start to realize, well, so if this is important and this is important, well, how do they connect? And at the state level, this is the pathway that was really highlighted as the most important area. If you live in Bradford, you might start to wonder, well, how does this connect to this? And this is a lower priority at the state level, because at the state level, they've kind of said, well, you know, that's a really good chunk of habitat, but it might not be the most important to connect. But locally, you might think, well, but if we don't have a connection between that and that, then what happens to the wildlife that live up here? And these are questions that will need to be wrestled with at different scales, everywhere from the landowner to the town, to the region, to the state, of what's important. What are the priorities? Now at this scale, as we look at not only the bigger chunks of forest and the connecting habitat in between, we can also start to add some other ways that wildlife travel through the landscape. So this map has the roads in there, and the roads and the houses and other development along those roads are that's what's kind of difficult for things to get across. You can start thinking about, well, how do they get from one area to another? One thing you can think about is the rivers and streams. If there are riparian areas, trees along the side of those streams and rivers, a lot of things travel along the sides of those rivers. It's not only good for the river or the stream to have that buffer, that patch of trees along the side, but all kinds of animals and wildlife will move up and down those as well. So thinking about how those might help wildlife travel through the landscape. Of course, if you have something like this, it's not necessarily helpful. Nothing's going to probably go through the culvert and it's in a really open area. But if you have bridges, all kinds of wildlife will go under bridges, not just fish, or those trees on the side of the stream. You can also think about where they're likely to cross the road. Now in Vermont, we have wildlife that seem to cross all over the place, but there are some kind of rules of thumb of where wildlife are most likely to cross. If there's forest or wetland, some kind of good cover on both sides of the road, they're far more likely to cross there than some place where there's an opening or a dwelling or a building. Places with a really steep slope on the side of the road, they're much less likely to cross there than when it's level. There are many species where if there's a guardrail on the side of the road, they won't cross there, they'll go around the edge. So even something like that kind of infrastructure can really dictate where wildlife are most likely to cross roads. And once we get into these roads, so it's mapped here where the roads that you see in red are the best for wildlife crossing, down to the green, which are the worst for wildlife crossing. And as you can imagine, they kind of correspond to the biggest patches of forest, but not always. You can start to use that information to think about, are they likely to go through this area? And if so, where? Looks like most of the roads in there are yellow, which is the same as the background color, so it's hard to see those, I'm sorry about that. But you can use that information to think about where wildlife are likely to travel. Now, as we think about this, we can zoom into individual places if anybody's interested. But in thinking about the big picture, so zooming back out to the state level and thinking about both where those big blocks of forest are, where those forest connections are, and then where those road crossings and stream crossings are that wildlife are likely to follow, a couple things kind of come out. Now, these maps were established at the state level, thinking about wildlife going up and down the Green Mountains, and across to the Adirondacks and over into New Hampshire and Maine and up into Canada. But at the state level, this is another region right here that really is significant on these maps. There's that link, there's that loop that goes off to the west of those other linkages. And if we zoom in on that, a couple of things stand out to me. One is that right here is an area that's really critical for any wildlife going from the Green Mountains over into the Upper Valley. There's kind of a pinch point there where that's where it happens. That's the connection. And if you zoom in on that and think about what that looks like, well, there are a couple bigger patches of forest. A lot of that's that connecting forest, though. It's not the biggest, best forest in the state, but that's what things are using to get across, to keep inbreeding from happening among populations, to keep those wildlife populations healthy. And when you think about it, you zoom in even more, you can start to see the roads and other things in there. So that's what that landscape looks like. There are a lot of roads going through there. When you start to think about it, this one road, I just kind of picked one at random. It could be any number of roads in that area, but what happens right there, there might be a few landowners. It might be a few parcels. I don't know what's happening right there. But what happens right there at that one connection has impacts at a much greater scale. Can wildlife continue to cross that road into the future? If so, it might have an impact, or if not, it might have an impact for the future of this whole region and the wildlife there. And in fact, it might have an impact on whether wildlife continue using these networks across the whole state. Come on in. And in fact, since our wildlife populations right now do interact and change around and move around, and our gene pool of our wildlife populations includes this entire area, it may have an impact not only for our town or our region or our state, but this entire area. What happens at that one little road crossing? So, I'll leave it at that, but we can certainly go back and look at some of those maps in more detail, or we'll answer questions. What do you think?
And I've got
And you have
the
some more,
same,
yeah.
the same map in a different color.
Okay, yeah, maybe we should do yours first and then we can go back to both. While Kevin is setting that up, are there questions that came up in that last section that we should talk about? I think Kevin's going to go more into, well, what did we do? What are some strategies we can use? But what do you think? I mean, I know we still haven't totally addressed your questions about Topsom, but...
Well, we might have, I sort of think so. I don't know Topsom that well, but I think of it as being pretty forested. I kind of suspect that if we looked at a map of Topsom, it probably has some pretty dark green in it.
Some, yeah.
Some, yeah, and maybe the folks of Topsom be thinking about, well, how do you just keep some connectivity through there? It may be a long ways away before that gets all kind of split up into little diced up 10-acre pieces. But speaking from, somebody who lives in Hartford and who kind of looks at maps that have Queechy Lakes on it, not that that's going to happen in Topsom. It's something to think about.
Yeah, it's mentioned something before I got here, but going back, back in the 1800s and all that, when most of Vermont was, and New England was open.
Right.
I mean, and then having dealt with a deer yard situation, some real estate I dealt with, and talking with the Paganelli, talk with him about it. We were talking about the history and how the deer population changed over the year, and how you could follow that along with the forest or station, And then the whole tick thing taken away, which I guess is part of the theories of possibly global warming or whatnot. Now that we're forested, much more forested than we used to be, I can't remember what it was, but isn't that the deer population is down now because of that? Because there's less feed?
Well, so
I
if
got
you
it
look at,
backwards.
so the deer population is pretty complicated, but in a lot of these, I mean, we kind of went through, I think you may not have been here when we really looked at what wildlife populations did from this time where Vermont was almost entirely forested, over 90% forested, down through the height of agriculture when the state was somewhere, around 20 or 30% forested, and then back up again. The deer population at that point actually completely disappeared. There were no deer in the state around 1900, and they were actually reintroduced. So deer certainly are one species, and when you look at one species, then there are all kinds of different habitats that they need, and it's more complicated than just looking at forests as a whole. Deer certainly need forest. They also do really well with a lot of openings and apple orchards and some agriculture. They're not a species that's totally forest dependent, but without that forest, especially you mentioned deer yards, they certainly need that forest sometimes of the year as well. Now for all of this that I'm talking about, we're kind of talking about this wildlife as a whole, which is including thousands of species, and forest as a whole, which is including all kinds of different forest types. When you start to look species by species, we're going to need to start narrowing down, it's not just any forest, it's a certain kind of forest, or, yeah.
How does it relate to, I'm from New Jersey a while ago, and I go down there periodically, and you're overrun with deer, and it's not forested at all.
Right.
I mean, there are...
Right.
So
well, there's also something that happens of the urbanization of deer is the phrase often that you hear. So places like New Jersey, there are deer populations that have figured out ways to live in a completely urban landscape. And so when you start to look at one species at a time, those stories certainly happen. You can have the urbanization of a population. Now, when you start to look at the health of that population, it's not necessarily...
It's worse than having no deer. I mean, because you've got Canadian geese and deer, and it's...
Right.
It's awful.
Right. And if we start to look at, the health of that deer herd, I mean, I don't know. I don't know the specifics there. But again, it still stands that those larger blocks of forest tend to be more biodiverse if we're looking at all species together as a whole. As you look, there are certainly species that have adapted to living in very urban places, but it's not the same biodiversity. I don't know if that fully answers it.
Monica, I'm concerned that the Bradford map is light green, making it look like it's not important. And I live on Route 25, and I know.
Right.
And you asked what happens to those animals, they end up dead on my lawn.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of deer crossing the Waits River, and bear cross there too, and moose.
Well, and that's where, and I respect that. And this is where those state level maps, I mean, we just, at the state level, we're looking at the entire state and what's important for the entire state, and there are some value judgments. But what really happens when we go to implement things, what you all decide as a region and as a town and as a group of landowners who neighbor each other, that's where these decisions, you'll have to make those value judgments of where wildlife really are and where are the forests locally that you want to see retained. And so there are places all over the state where people are going to say the same things of, no, this is priority, this has to be really great wildlife habitat, and it is.
Well, how can
but
we,
you need to make some of those decisions locally as well.
How can we, though, as part of the planning commission, as some of these are, or select board, go in and say, okay, your family may have owned that land for the last 80 years, but we've decided we need it to be a wildlife runway.
Good leading question.
Good segue into what Kevin has, I think.
It's been zoned one way since the 1970s.
Well, we're taking away somebody's livelihood.
Right.
That is their land, and if they want to sell it, who are we to say, no, I want some white-tailed deer in there, and you can't do anything with it?
So that's kind of my life right there. But Frank, you had a counter question. Then we're going to get back
We
to
talk about large forest blocks
And we've focused on our intervention on the landscape through hard impact, whether it's housing or road or agriculture. Let's pretend that we've got these large forest blocks and they're conserved, but we open them to recreation. What effect does intensive recreation do to fragmentation and species migration? Because we've got these huge blocks in the kingdom,
Right,
but we've got kingdom trails.
right.
Does the use of this conserved large block by 15,000 people over 4 seasons, well, the land's in one piece, but we have massive amounts of disruptive human activity across the land. Are we still considering those unfragmented
So,
blocks? How do you think about that?
That's a really good question. And so in terms of our maps,
Yeah.
we definitely include those
Okay.
as part of those large blocks. And
Right.
the reasoning is because, yes, there's a continuum, right?
Right.
From totally undeveloped, untouched by human, to developed, to paved over.
Right.
And there's a whole continuum. And yes, certain forms of recreation do have impacts on wildlife. Most of those forms of recreation are reversible, is one of the big things here. If you create a parking lot, it's potentially eventually reversible, but it has a huge impact and it's really hard to change that. If you have a mountain biking trail, there are some impacts, but in comparison, those are really minor. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any impacts. We can definitely talk about the particulars of that at a different time. But it's on that continuum.
Okay.
So as we put aside these maps, we're really just marking, these are the undeveloped landscapes. I mean, as far as management, as far as recreation, as far as what happens there, the primary goal is keeping them undeveloped. Any activities that keep them undeveloped is better for wildlife than developing it, right? And so if we start with that, that's really what's being taken care of by these maps.
So, just to explain what this map is, because the color scheme is different. And then I'm going to get to your question, because that is the nub of a lot of things right there. So, the dark green here are the highest priority interior forest blocks, kind of like the dark green. This lighter green here are the lower, but they're still priority, forest blocks. The dark blue are the highest priority connectivity blocks, and the light blue are the medium connector or priority connectivity blocks. The things that are kind of in turquoise, right here, are both the lower level of the connectivity and the forest blocks combined. So, for example, here, you have, well, this is the best forest, this is the best connector, okay, maybe we need that. Well, this is the priority forest and the priority connector on top of each other. So this only has one attribute that you're looking for. This only has one attribute you're looking for. This has 2 attributes you're looking for. And so these may be important layers to look at. Layers is what we call them in the map book. And so I've zoomed in. So we're up in here in Bradford. And I've tried to get the nub of Hartford down here just to get us all the way through to Newbury. But what you can tell from the region is we have this big V. I call it the big V. Because we have the greens over here and then this pathway here. I live right here on the bottom of this chunk there. And Monica is so right in that when we look at the connectivity threat, it's here. So from a policy perspective, we might worry about that more than we worry about Thompson. Because our opportunities are greater in Thompson. We have more leeway, as it were, to muck about with things. But the question you raise is a perfectly good question, which is, how do we take the individual landowner who has an individual chunk of forest, right? And they've had plans, Lord knows what, different things. They're either going to sell it, it's their retirement or whatever. So they've got a bunch of stuff that they want to do with that piece of land. All the way to zoom out to statewide, multi-state, but at least on my desk is the regional idea. So one of the things that the Regional Planning Commission has to do under one of the new laws that have to do with forest blocks is we have to have policies around how those interior forest blocks and those connectivity things are going to be dealt with. And so we don't have to have great policies, but we have to have some kind of policies around it. The statute says we have to address that issue. And so we could address it through a variety of mechanisms, all the way from thou shalt not to the doesn't get you much. The we wish you wouldn't do anything doesn't get you much. It may make you feel like you did something, but actually in the regulatory world it doesn't do anything at all. To the thou shalt not gets you a lot of stuff, but it really torques the people who wanted to do a bunch of things for that piece of land. And so to me that's the balance, and that's the crux, because we have all these values that we say we want in the forest, that the Monica showed. And then that particular person has a set of values too that they want. They want to retire, they want to go to Florida.
They might have a failed dairy farm or something.
Yeah, and so when I sit down at my desk, the thing I try to do is go, how can I do that and that? How can I best do that? And I would hope that at the town level, when you sit on planning commissions or select boards, that's also what you do. And the way that that translates into regional planning or town planning is looking at the future land use plan. This kind of the most single one graphic thing where we go, how do we do this thing? And so I'm going to try to zoom back out a little bit here. So this is our current future land use map for the regional plan. And if this was a town, and you guys did a future land use map that looked like this, we'd be like, we would not be happy with it, right? So it's not right that we have a future land use map that looks like this. So by the way, for most of your towns are similar, you have large parts of your town are usually rural, and you propose rural in your town plans. The white on that map is the rural, the reds and pinks and those type of things are the town centers and whatnot. The green is currently resource conservation area in the regional plan. It makes up about 90% of the region. We think we should get rid of that map and probably use a bunch of this data to make a better map. This data, again, if we were looking at a town plan map, your town plan looks a lot more like this than like that. Only Plymouth used to have what I call the blobs, and lots of teeny blobs. Nobody could find them on the map, by the way, too, if you tried to zoom in and figure out where you were. So there are places that are more important and less important for forest species. Heartland, a lot of forest in Heartland, very fragmented already. Up here in the Randolph-Tunbridge area, this is our ag center. So that's a lot of open land in there that's undeveloped, but it's agriculture. So we're kind of in this corridor here. And if you're a town like West Fairleigh, everything is either highest priority forest block or highest priority connectivity. Except if we zoomed in, there'd be little bits around the houses. And pretty much what they use is they use the Landsat 30-meter grid satellite data, which is the best rough, full land cover data that we have. And so that, as long as your house isn't too hidden by the trees, the satellites pick it up, and that's why in Monica's slides you saw those little kind of white dots, because those are generally around houses that have at least a little broken forest cover of a 30-meter grid size. So then, to me, the issue that I'm going to ask you is how tightly do we try to achieve those goals? And we can make it all the way from not tight to tight. But there's two things to me that we have to do. One, I have to meet the law, so I have to write a policy that addresses these things, because law says regional planning commissions shall do that. And I have to do it legally, right? Can't just write stuff that's going to be illegal. And I have to do it in ways that'll pass a social test. So you all can go, because the same thing that we do at the regional level might help you in Hartford or Thompson or Bradford or other places. Especially to me, probably in the Sharon and Royalton, Pomfret area where we have this issue here. And so when I look at folks like East Barnard, this is Barnard, the town of Barnard here. So the town of Barnard's future land use map has a big conservation area on the left, on the west side, which is part of what they call the Chattagee No-Town area, which is about 50,000 acres, mostly private timberlands over here. And so their town plan has a big conservation proposed land use area, and it has a smaller conservation area right over here in this critical link around what we call East Barnard, for those of you who know where East Barnard is, which is almost in Pomfret. It is, you come down the hill and you're by the church there, and you're actually in Pomfret right there, and then when you go out by Broadwick Fire, you've entered in the
Around the corner.
Right. And then we have kind of some of the Quimby Mountain areas here in Sharon, that type of thing. But a critical area, if we're to keep that, because you can imagine it's like anything where you want a connectivity. If this was a road, and we said, well, it's a perfectly fine road, except we just took away a mile of it. But other than that, it's a perfectly fine interstate. But we'd all go, well, that's not a good interstate, because we need the mile. Yes, yes.
Going back to her question about the person who wants to retire and is planning to sell their land, doesn't the same law that calls for saving these big forest blocks also say that there will be incentives for landowners to do this?
The planning statute doesn't say that. I'm sure both the Department of Forest and Parks and the Department of Fish and Wildlife would love to see that. And some of the reports that came into the legislature from the past 2 years that dealt specifically around forest fragmentation talked about that issue, and they say, we should do a variety of things to make that happen. This, from a policy perspective, is one of the places where I go, we can probably meet those landowners' needs and get most of what we want if we do it carefully. So, same houses, same amount of development, probably the same value, both things. One, if we're here, we're thinking about the fields. We've put houses in the middle of fields here, we've put houses at the edge. This comes down to, from a policy point of view, if you want this to occur and not that to occur, do you say, we wish you would do this, or thou shalt do this? If you say, we wish you would do this, you might get it, and you might not. If we say, thou shalt, then you get this. And is that important or not? Do we care if we fail? Because if we fail, we don't get the species. And that's, to me, that's the hardest part of all this planning, is if we say we wish for something to happen, but we don't actually do anything that makes it happen, we should expect it not to happen. And as a planner, I know a lot of my life is spent writing things that are wishes, which make us feel good, but don't necessarily affect the change that we want.
But your wish and a landowner's desire
Correct.
aren't even close in a lot of cases.
Well, here, if I say you're going to make just as much money, then there's no monetary argument.
I'm thinking bigger here for a moment, and I'm pulling this out of headline. It has nothing to do with me.
Sure, yeah.
The Sharon Royalton area,
Oh, back there, yeah.
back in the paper there last summer.
Oh, with New Vista, you're talking?
Yes.
Yes.
that is also right in that corridor of linking east and west side of the state.
That's actually right here. I think Tunbridge and Stratford would, it's actually right here, excuse me. I think that they wished it was more priority. Because when we look at that at the regional scale, I go, not as important as this over here.
Mhm.
But that might be, to me, and that's where it's very important for you all to come in, because you might go, well, you know what? We'd rather you connect here than, this part here, or something. You may go, that's what we want. But the New Vista development, for those of you who didn't follow it, is a mega, it's not even a proposal, it's just an idea to put 2 Hartfords in 2 square miles right here. It's the boiled down version of this. Marcy?
So you're talking about home placement.
Yep.
So how would you do that if you didn't have subdivision regulations, you just had zoning bylaws?
So in zoning bylaws, it would, if you just had zoning, well, first off, what do we have? West Fairleigh, Topsom, Corinth, Tunbridge, no zoning or subdivision. Corinth has subdivision only. So if you didn't have any regulation, how would you do it? And I have no regulation at the regional planning board, right? There's no regional zoning. So the only way you can affect change, for sure, is through tight plan language, both at the town plan or the regional plan language, that is what we call specific and directive. Because if the regional plan or the town plan says, we wish you wouldn't do this, come Act 250. Act 250 can't take that language and make it into a thou shalt not do this. And we have a lot of people who show up at hearings and go, your plan says you don't want it. And you go, no, the plan says we encourage you not to, or we want you to consider it.
But most things don't come under Act 250.
Exactly. And so that's why you need a whole bunch of tools in the old tool belt. One of the biggest tools that we have is the regional plan and regional plan language. But there are other things, whether it's working with our conservation organizations directly about conservation easements. So, for example, if we're right in this neck of the woods, I've long worked on some stuff right around there, whether it's working with the state, whether it's working with the town, on town forest, whether it's working maybe directly with large timber owners. I used to, I was a planner in the kingdom for a lot of years. I was involved in the Champions Lands purchase.
So you take a proactive approach, not like zoning and subdivision is sort of a passive, you come to us and you say what to do.
Correct.
This is going to the landowner and saying, as a town, saying we'd like you to conserve this.
Yeah, we'd like you to conserve this. As a conservation commission, you might go, that particular parcel is really important to us. What are your plans with it? And can we get you a bunch of money?
And so from the town plan, the planning commission, I guess, would direct the conservation commission approach to things?
Well, you don't really kind of direct them necessarily, but hopefully they're working in concert with you. Right. And you can talk about that in your town plan. When VHC, when the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, uses state monies that go to them to do conservation, they, for example, always ask us, does this comply with the regional plan? And they could ask you, because there might be a piece where you go, no, that's where we really were planning to expand in our own little way, Topsom or whatever, because the problems that we have about, let's all build in the villages in Topsom, or Corinth, or Berkshire, or whatever, is there's no sewer and water. Right? So it's not like you can put a lot more houses in West Newbury, because there's no sewer and water to go under. Or East Topsom. East Topsom, even right now, is probably, you couldn't build East Topsom today as it's currently built, because it's more dense than works. So it's kind of like my house a few years ago. It's like mystery, but it works, right? Until it doesn't work, and then you spend a lot of money. So that's, But to me, that issue, and so did you have like a particular scenario you wanted to walk through?
I was sort of curious about the Scott Mill,
Ah, Scott Mill, okay.
another headline.
So Scott Mill, another headline, that is an example where the regional plan had specific directive language, which said thou shalt not put principal retail outside of town centers, and there's principal retail is what the Supreme Court said. And so, straight reading, we're not, the plan's the plan's the plan. The court reads it and goes, nope, no can do. So things that hit Act 250, like New Vista, should New Vista ever materialize, or more likely many New Vistas out there. And there are at least 5 New Vista-ish type projects that I'm aware of in the United States by different entities who want to build such things. Major corporations, you name it. Because they like, let's build a sustainable place. I would not pick bumpy spot in the middle of Vermont. Do that from a straight engineering perspective. I would pick someplace flatter, probably easier to get to. Detroit. And maybe the weather. Detroit would actually be a great example. Because you go, hey, it's already got highways there and it's flat. I could buy it really cheap compared to here. You could buy, Detroit's in the process of demolishing 240,000 houses, just so you get a scale of Detroit. Except they don't have money to demolish the houses. That's where Detroit is. They could really do it, versus, in the middle of here. But should a project trigger Act 250, and just so you all are clear, in most of your towns that's 6 houses or 6 lots within 5 years, within 5 miles. So a farm can kind of chop itself up slowly, never trigger Act 250. Okay.
So, the rebel town that says, okay, this regional, please.
Oh, sorry.
A rebel town that says, no, we don't have zoning, we don't have subdivision rules.
Yes.
We want to be able to, continue with a house here, a house there.
Correct.
And I see my land is in the dark green.
Oh.
I have 3 house lots now, but in 2 more years, I can do another 5 lots.
Correct.
So what is this plan going to do to me wanting 5 more lots?
Right, so both either a town plan or a regional plan would have no effect on you because you're not triggering Act 250.
Right.
And so Act 250 basically, at a certain point they said, this is under the radar, whatever. And for towns without zoning and subdivision, it's 6 within 5 years, within 5 miles. So you can, as long as you do basically 1 a year, you can do that forever. And there's
not that I want to, but
right. And that's where it's also important, though, for town plans and for the regional plan to have stuff that's not Act 250 related necessarily. Like, consult with foresters and wildlife biologists on a subdivision, because a lot of people, they're not necessarily thinking about wildlife policy, every day, right? They're kind of going, I need some money. I got a big chunk of forest. Realtor, and the realtor doesn't go, you know what? We should look at the habitat value out there. Does not necessarily happen. But some of that can get connected. Conservation commissions can help us get connected. I worked with one of my neighbors, had a big chunk of land, never put in car use. Put in car use because that's a way. It's not a permanent way, but it is a way at least to lessen the tax pressure on flipping.
yes, but the state does not fully fund current use, so therefore many towns are looking at that as we're losing money every time a landowner puts it in current use.
Right, there's a variety of issues around current use. One is that the legislature funds it every year, so it's not like it has a permanent source of funding. It's good at keeping forest intact as forest and managed forest, it's less so on keeping the habitat values in there necessarily. And as you say, there's some tax discrepancy in that.
And
the
every time they change it, you can pull out with no penalty.
Right, and the penalty is slightly hurtful, but not that enough. It's not enough to keep anybody from selling land that's worth anything. So it's not a great thing, but it sure beats if you're going to have a big chunk of forest, 400 or 500 acres, and you don't have it in current use. Probably a good idea to go put it in current use. Ted, you had.
Yeah, if you can go ahead to your next slide, where you have the two different layouts for the subdivisions. I totally understand what you're doing, and I support it. I think it's all great, but since Bradford's plan is now roughly 50 pages, and your regional plan is probably a couple hundred pages, I can just see somebody saying, well, the energy part of our plan encourages passive solar. So if we put the house in the middle of the woods, or in the shade, we're going to have to burn fossil fuel. But if we put it in an area where you get lots of sunshine, so even as great as this is, it's in conflict with another part of our town plan.
Yeah, I think
Nobody said this was easy.
nobody said this was easy, right?
And all of us who serve on boards and commissions do so voluntarily, and we wonder why the hell we subject ourselves to this. Because there's no way out.
Well, and then on the good side, I would guess, at least from energy, because right now we're working on the energy part too, is for the open fields. We policy-wise, we would much rather you put solar here than chop down the forest and put the solar in the forest. And one of the
I wasn't talking about a solar,
like a big solar.
No, I was just talking about passive solar heating of the houses.
Yes.
And how that argument could be to put the house in the middle of the field as opposed to...
Yeah, or at least not like in the trees, but scooch them out a little bit there to get that stuff.
Yeah.
And so we've been debating policies around, and not policies around thou shalt not build in the forest, by the way. But let's not build a lot in the forest. Maybe a thing, let's try to build more over here and less over here, but it's not what the plan we call a green line concept though. You can only build over here, no building over here. And when you build, let's at least have to think about what you're doing in terms of forestry or what you're doing in terms of wildlife. In the rural areas, we look at ag soils, but Act 50 already deals with ag soils pretty well. And if it's small, like Monica said, kind of if you're 20 acres or less, and you got a bunch of trees, from a regional perspective, we don't care. Like that's just cooked, right? Gone. So at some point, there's a don't bother type of thing going on. But there is certain stuff where I would say, and again down towards my neck of the woods, where those linkages are really important. Because we don't strand populations so that they don't interbreed. And this issue of the climate moving. The climate is moving. Regardless of whether you think why the climate is moving, but we're roughly moving about 20 feet north a year, about 4 miles, 20 feet a day. About 4 miles a year is our current pace. The pace is picking up. And we are well on the way to being West Virginia within most of your lifetimes in terms of climate. Now, John can tell us how fast trees walk, but besides Lords of the Rings, they walk kind of mostly really slowly. But they can propagate out.
They get help from blue jays.
They get help from blue jays, yes. But they can't propagate and then grow and then get a seed to propagate again that fast. Whereas animals can actually move pretty fast, except the small ones. But things are certainly moving northward, and so we do need those pathways for the things southwest to move north, as well as for things that are low to move up to stay in those areas. And this is my kind of non-technical slide about fragmentation. It's still the Mona Lisa. Somebody just cut it in half, right? And so if you were the Louvre, you would not be happy.